I did not set out to write a novel about seven generations of women. I think if that was the initial thought, I would have been a little gun shy about it. So I'm glad that wasn't the first ambition. The first, this novel, the story began with Tatiana. I affectionately call Tati. She's 14. She's novel opens with her in 1995 on the south side of Chicago. It's her birthday. And she doesn't know her father. And she's very angsty, but also very angry at her mother and her grandmother because they are keeping the secret from her. And, by 14, she's asked questions since she's been a little girl and never gotten any answers. She doesn't know anything about this man. And she romanticizes him in her poetry that she writes in a notebook that she keeps under her mattress in her home. And so, like, she was the first character that came to me. And I always knew her mother, Nadia, was a beautician, and that she had a basement salon, which is like an ode to how I grew up on the south side of Chicago, going to many a basement or kitchen beautician to get my hair done as a kid. And initially, when I conceived the story, I thought it was going to be Tati having a lot of anger for her father because he wasn't there. But because he wasn't there, she could only be angry at the people she knew. And so immediately she took on a life of her own. Nadia took on a life of her own. And then their grandmother was there, Gladys. She was always there. She was never a central figure in the first draft, but she was always there, kind of mean spirited, very, very surly, these one liners, very headstrong. And I couldn't figure out why, but she was just being this way. And it wasn't until I got to the end of the first draft, and the first draft just was Tati's story, Nadia's story, and then the resolution of Tati finding her father. And it was in one of the scenes that's still in the novel today, was the Thanksgiving scene. And there's this big blow up because now Tati's like 18, 19, and she knows her father's name, but she doesn't know anything else about him. And so Gladys said something in this draft, and it's still in the novel. She says something like, what happens to light skinned women in the South? And it, for me, when I'm writing, I'm not always conscious of this is a pivotal moment that's going to change the story for me. I'm just writing, and then I let it develop from there. So I wrote the line and it was kind of a throwaway to me. But when I finished the first draft, it that line and Gladys lingered so much that I was like, well, what happened to Gladys? And then I had this vision of this woman on the cover in this white dress walking down this dirt road. And in the novel, she has a pair of shoes in one hand and a hat on her head. And I was like, that's Gladys. I'm like, well, where is she going? And I saw where she was going. And then the picture got a little wider and I saw a pickup truck behind her. And I was like, oh, I know, right? And so, I mean, that image lingered for a few months. And it wasn't until I heard a friend and fellow author, Disha Philia, talking on a podcast about writing the best first line possible that the seven generations clicked into place. Because when I heard her say that, like, what is the best first line that you could ever write to start your novel? That first line of my novel then descended on me. They cut off her head because she ran. And I was like, oh, and I knew from that first line, I knew I was dealing with enslavement. I knew it was the same story. And I knew because I was dealing with enslavement, I was going to have to do a few generations. And so I was like, all right, seven is considered the number of completion, divine number of completion. So I was like, okay, we'll do seven daughters, seven women, seven generations, seven chapters for each of them. That's how I was thinking of it. Because I thought I would write it backwards because I started with Tati, I had Nadia, and then I would write the rest of the women and go all the way backwards to the beginning. And so when I had that idea from that first line, I think I jotted a quick paragraph that became the prologue in my notes app. And then I just started asking the questions, the journalist and me interviewing, what are your names? What are your stories? What are your issues? What happened to you? And all of that. And then as they kind of got built up and were influenced by some things that were happening in my life, I began to write a little less than a year after I started the very first draft with just Tati and Nadia, and I started with Gladys. And then I went to her mother, Ruby, and Ruby is very dark skinned and she's one of the darkest members in her family, and she's kind of shunned because of it. And that's because her mother, Juby, was light enough to pass and tried until she gave birth to this dark child. Um, Jubilee's mother, this Juby's full name, she goes by Juby, but her full name is Jubilee. Uh, Jubilee's mother is Emma, and Emma was born in enslavement and is the daughter of the woman at the head of the line who no one knows her name. They just know that legend of how she died. And so I knew that for the bulk of the book, everyone was going to be free, even if they were experiencing Jim Crow and discrimination and prejudice. I wanted to make where they lived in Lands End, Alabama, a bit of a utopia, but not so much so. So, like, there's a line in the book that talks about how, on one side of the tracks was the Dupree family and their farm, and that's where most of the Black people in town lived, and they had their own businesses and their own thriving community, but they didn't have a general store. And so that was one thing that the white people on the other side of the tracks had to hold over the Black families to still make them feel superior, so then that it wouldn't lead to this, what we saw like in Tulsa or Rosewood or Coe and all these other places where Black enclaves were bombed and looted. So that was the compromise that made Lands End this utopia. Because I mean, if it's in Alabama, you have Birmingham and you have Montgomery, and Birmingham's nicknamed Birmingham, right? So I was okay. We're gonna incorporate the Alabama history, but we're gonna still try to make this a bit of an idyllic utopia. And the influence for Land's End and even the story of the enslaved ancestor I was obsessed at the time with the story of the Clotilda in Mobile and Africa Town. But I bought all the books to do all the research, and then I was like, I don't want to be beholden to that story. So, which is why I fictionalized it, and so I could do what I wanted to do on the page. And then also the history of Kingsley Plantation here in Jacksonville, where I live, where the an African woman, Anna Kingsley, she was a child. She was 13 when she was kidnapped from Senegal by Zephaniah Kingsley. First, I think she was first brought to Cuba before she was brought to Florida. But by the time she arrived in Florida, she was pregnant with his child. She was recognized as his wife. She had several children for him. I think she had 4 children for him. But eventually he emancipated her. She emancipated her children and other family members, and they ran Kingsley Plantation here in Jacksonville. And so I had written this entirely long essay about that for the Bitter Southerner. And so that was in my mind. And Kingsley Plantation is connected to a place called American Beach in Nassau County, which was a Black beach, 200 acres, that was bought by a man named Abraham Lincoln Lewis, who was Florida's first Black millionaire. He was from Jacksonville, Florida. He bought it around 1930. 233. So in the middle of the Great Depression, he and his business partners from the Afro-American Life Insurance Company bought this stretch of land so that because of the Jim Crow South, Black people couldn't go to certain beaches. So now they had their own beach to go to. So I included all of that lore and history in the creation of Lands End and the Dupree family, and how this land was passed down from not necessarily the enslaved ancestor, but because of what happened to her through her daughters, Emma, Juby, Ruby, Gladys, Nadia, and Tatiana. And so you see their stories play out. And then in the epilogue, you see Tati and Nadia go back to Alabama, to the land, and make a home there. And so those are the daughters. I call it a birthing curse. So when I first started writing, Gladys had 2 sons. She has 2 boys. So it's Nadia, and Nadia has 2 brothers. They're 2 younger brothers, much younger brothers, but she has two brothers. I think Brian and Terry, I think are their names. Maybe. I don't know. But I think their names are Brian and Terry. It's been a minute since I've read the book. And so then when I got to this expanded storyline and realized that I was writing this curse, I had to explain why Gladys had these boys. But before that, it's really shown in Emma's story that she had trouble carrying boys. Like either they were stillborn or she had miscarriages. The only thing that she was ever able to successfully birth was a little girl, and she only had the one which was Juby. And same thing happened to Juby, and Juby was only able to successfully birth Ruby. And so then when Ruby got pregnant with Gladys, they told her, you got a girl on the first try. Be lucky, be glad. That's all you're going to get. And so, and then Gladys has Nadia first, and then Nadia has Tati, and then Tati, we'll see at the end of the book that she has a daughter of her own. That storyline and that premise of the birthing curse came from my freelance work. I left television in 2019 to be a writer, but to make ends meet and to still like pay my phone bill and my student loan, I started freelancing full time. And when the pandemic started in 2020, my first thought was, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to pregnant women? Right. And so I started writing a lot about um, pregnancy and birthing during the pandemic, how it was happening, how it was taking place, and then overall the Black maternal health crisis. Because before the pandemic, Black women's maternal mortality rate was 2 times that of white women. And then in the pandemic, it increased to 4 times the rate of white women. And now I think post pandemic, it's maybe 3 times the rate of white women. And with the rollback of Roe and the draconian laws around birth control and really controlling a woman's right, not only her right to choose, but her own bodily autonomy, we have seen the number of women, period, in the United States, but Black women specifically, their death rates increase when they are, pregnant, either because they're trying to seek care because they're having a miscarriage and doctors won't see them because they don't want to get sued, or they're having an ectopic pregnancy and doctors won't see them until it's too late, or just all these different things are happening. So I was writing a lot about that in 2020 and 2021, and 2022 was the last year that I freelanced. And so I had interviewed so many different women about their birth stories, about how they were treated by doctors, by midwives, by doulas, about the complications they ran into. Like some had heart attacks and were told they were having panic attacks. And they were like, when they finally went to the hospital, they were like, oh, you should have been dead already, but you're still alive, but your heart is torn in two and you have got all these blockages. Like all these like crazy stories. And one woman I interviewed is a local artist who lives here. And I've followed her online and we've met in person several times. And she had a baby boy in the pandemic in 2020. And it was her first son. She has 2 daughters, but she had been pregnant a few times before that and had lost those children. Either they were born early and didn't survive, or something like that. And there was another woman locally who had the same thing happen to her too, where, they went into labor very, very early, 22, 23 weeks. And the babies didn't survive. So, the whole conversation about viability is a moot point to me. And I interviewed her and I remember asking her, how many times have you been pregnant? And she said, I've been pregnant 8 times, but she has 3 children, 2 girls, and she finally got her boy. And I think her last 2 births before her son now, that she lost, that were born early and didn't survive, were boys. And so I didn't realize it at the time that her story had stayed with me and lingered with me the way that it did after I did the interview. But when I wrote Emma's chapter, where she, is very excited to start her family, and the line comes until the blood, it just kind of flowed out of me that there was this birthing curse, and that was how the enslaved ancestor impressed her will upon the entire line of women. Because it was like, she was pregnant when she was beheaded, which is, again, not a spoiler, because for the first line of the novel. And so the way that she shows up is making sure that her lineage can only have what she did not get to keep, which was she didn't get to have and hold her own daughter. So now her lineage can only have daughters because of that. And that grew out of that storyline grew directly out of the work that I was doing as a journalist and as a freelance writer around Black maternal health. Scenes in Chicago. So for Nadia and Tati's chapters were there, is very much in the city of Chicago. That was really my nostalgia. And then, my parents are from New Orleans, from the South. I live in the South. I've lived in the South a very long time now. And so language and dialect and how people speak, I love listening to people. And so what was kind of the guiding light there is a quote from Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, where I really should memorize it. But she says something to the effect that, the children of the Great Migration who were born in the North, their voices sound hard, kind of like cracked concrete, while their parents and their grandparents have voices that are smooth or like smooth as butter or something like that. Whatever way she said it, again, I'm really gonna have to find and like remember this quote because I use it all the time. That was like the guiding line for me because I recognized it in my own voice. When I'm in Chicago, my voice is a little rougher than it is when I'm here where I live in Florida. And I can hear it in my mother's voice. Her voice is a little rougher, a little more sharp when she's in Chicago than when she goes home to New Orleans. Her accent comes back. It's not as thick as like my cousins or my aunts, but it comes back. And so I always tried to make sure that that was representative, specifically in my novel Beyond Bourbon Street, which was my last novel before The Seven Daughters of Dupree. And in this novel, I'll try to make sure that that quote from Isabel Wilkerson was guiding me. So Tati and Nadia's sections were easier. And then when we came south, and even when Gladys is in Chicago, her voice is a little more sharper than it is when she's like 17, 18 in Land's End. And so when we get to Land's End, I wanted to make the language, even in the description, not just the dialogue, a little more lush, um, a little more secretive, a little more hidden, because they are carrying secrets that they don't want to tell. So I use the word perhaps a lot, or maybe, or then like I'll keep turning the story around so that you don't really know what's true with a but or a yet or and then. And I, I think about it rhythmically. Like I wanted it to flow. I wanted it to sound like the landscape. And so the landscape is this lush and this vibrant farm and has been for decades, a century even, then that's the way they should sound. And so pulling the language, the broken English or pidgin English of Evangeline, who was enslaved, but Emma goes to school, so her language is a little, vocabulary is a little fuller. Juby ends up going off to college, passing for white and marrying into this white family. So her language is a little more highbrow. Um, and then just being able to make them distinct. And my background as a news producer taught me to write for voice. And so it took me a while to find Gladys's voice, but once I did, everybody showed up because when I started writing Gladys's story, everybody was there. Emma, Ruby, and Juby. They were all there with her. They were different ages, but they were all there. So I was able to make them distinct in just her section so that when I started writing their sections, I already knew who they were. I knew what they sounded like, and I knew who they were, and I knew who they were and how distinct to make them. And so that was kind of how I tried to craft each character and each voice so that they were distinct so that you would know who was talking to you, even if I never said.